In the 1st century before the Common Era, the vast lands west of the Rhine and north of the Alps were known to the Romans as Gaul, a patchwork of fierce, independent tribes who had long defied the power of any single ruler. These were the Gauls, Celtic peoples of extraordinary warrior tradition. They built cities, traded across continents, and forged iron with skill that rivaled Rome itself. But unity among them was as rare as peace. In 58 BC, a Roman general named Gaius Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul as its new governor. Brilliant, ruthless, and driven by an ambition that knew no ceiling, Caesar saw in Gaul not just a province to administer, but a conquest that would make him the most powerful man in Rome. Over 7 years, Caesar led his legions deep into Gallic territory. He crossed rivers, shattered armies, burned oppida, and forced tribe after tribe to submit. By 52 BC, Rome's eagle standards flew over much of what is today France. But the Gauls had not surrendered. In the winter of 52 BC, the tribes rose in a great coordinated rebellion, the most dangerous uprising Caesar had ever faced, and at its heart stood one extraordinary man, Vercingetorix, son of a Gallic king, leader of the Arverni tribe. Young, magnetic, and strategically gifted, he accomplished what no Gallic leader had managed before. He united dozens of rival tribes under a single command and a single purpose: to drive Rome from Gaul forever. Vercingetorix's strategy was sharp. Rather than meeting Rome in open battle, where legionary discipline was devastating, he ordered a scorched earth campaign, burning Gallic towns before Caesar could use them, cutting supply lines, and bleeding the Romans slowly through attrition. The strategy nearly worked, but at the town of Avaricum, Vercingetorix was overruled by its citizens, who refused to burn their home. Caesar besieged it, and after weeks of brutal fighting, Rome broke through and slaughtered 25,000 Gauls. Yet even in defeat, Vercingetorix survived with his army intact. He withdrew, regrouped, and waited. The rebellion was not broken, it was gathering. At Gergovia, Vercingetorix achieved his greatest triumph. He inflicted a rare defeat on Caesar, killing nearly 700 legionaries and forcing a Roman withdrawal. All of Gaul trembled with hope. Caesar, for the first time, seemed beatable. Emboldened by Gergovia, Vercingetorix made his boldest gamble. He unleashed his cavalry, the finest in Gaul, to smash Caesar's retreating army and end the war in a single blow. But Caesar had anticipated this. He deployed his Germanic cavalry allies, ferocious horsemen from across the Rhine, who tore into the Gallic riders with savage efficiency. The Gallic cavalry was shattered. Vercingetorix had lost his greatest mobile asset. With his cavalry broken and Caesar's legions closing, Vercingetorix made a calculated decision. He would withdraw to the heavily fortified hilltop town of Alesia, regroup his forces, and send word to all of Gaul to assemble a massive relief army that would crush the Romans between two fires. Alesia sat atop Mont Ossois, a formidable plateau rising steeply above the valley floors of the Ouse and Oseraine rivers. With 80,000 Gallic warriors behind its walls, it seemed virtually unassailable. Caesar looked at Alesia. He looked at its walls, its height, its garrison. Any Roman general might have chosen to wait, to starve it slowly, to keep a distance. Caesar chose something far more audacious. He would not merely blockade Alesia, he would encircle it completely, with walls of his own. He would build a ring of Roman fortifications around the entire hill, trapping Vercingetorix inside, and then build a second outer ring facing outward, to stop the relief army when it came. What Caesar was proposing was one of the most ambitious engineering feats in military history. A double wall system stretching over 40 kilometers in total length, bristling with towers, ditches, traps, and obstacles. And he planned to build it before the relief army arrived. Caesar's engineers went to work with extraordinary speed. The inner wall, the circumvallation, stretched 11 miles around the base of Alesia's hill, designed to keep Vercingetorix and his 80,000 men locked inside. The inner line featured 2 ditches, each 15 feet wide, the inner one flooded by diverting nearby rivers. Behind the ditches rose a 12-foot rampart, topped with a wooden palisade and battlements. Every 80 feet stood a watchtower, manned by Roman sentries day and night. Before the ditches, Caesar's men planted layers of cunning traps. First, rows of angled, sharpened stakes, called cippi, like thorns no cavalry could push through. Then, concealed pits, the lilia, lined with fire-hardened stakes. Then, iron barbs scattered in the grass to lame horses and wound feet. The outer wall, the contravallation, stretched 14 miles in circumference, facing outward to meet the Gallic relief army. Between the 2 walls lay a corridor occupied by Caesar's entire army, 50,000 Roman soldiers sandwiched between 80,000 Gauls inside and potentially hundreds of thousands approaching from outside. It took approximately 3 weeks. By the time the last stakes were driven into the ground, Caesar had created what military historians would later call one of the greatest siege works of the ancient world. Now he waited. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the Roman walls rise with growing concern. Food reserves were counted carefully. He had sent his cavalry through before the ring closed, racing across Gaul to summon the relief army. But inside the walls, 80,000 mouths needed feeding every day. Vercingetorix calculated his supplies would last about 30 days. The relief army had to arrive within that window, or Alesia would starve. He dispatched runners through the Roman lines with desperate urgency. Every tribe in Gaul must send warriors. Everything depended on what came next. The response across Gaul was extraordinary. Tribe after tribe sent their warriors: Arverni, Aedui, Sequani, Bellovaci, Bituriges, and dozens more. From every corner of the land, men took up their weapons and marched toward Alesia. Caesar himself recorded the numbers in his account of the war. The relief army that assembled numbered, according to his account, 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even accounting for Roman exaggeration, it was a force of staggering size, the largest Gallic army ever assembled. Command of the relief army fell to 4 leaders, among them Vercingetorix, a cousin of Vercingetorix, and Commius, of the Atrebates tribe, a man Caesar had once trusted as an ally and who now burned with hatred for Rome. They were capable commanders, and they had numbers on their side. When the relief army appeared on the hills west of Alesia, the sight shook the very ground. From the Roman walls, soldiers looked out at a tide of humanity stretching across every ridge and slope. From Alesia's heights, Vercingetorix's warriors saw it too, and erupted in a roar that echoed across the valleys. Inside the Roman lines, Caesar met with his generals. The situation was as dangerous as it could be, but Caesar's voice, by every account, was calm. He had built his walls for exactly this moment. Now was the time to trust the engineering and the legions. The Romans now faced enemies on both sides. Every section of wall had to be defended simultaneously. Caesar positioned his forces carefully, the best units at the most vulnerable points, cavalry reserves held in the center, ready to ride to any breach. The relief army struck first with its cavalry, thousands of Celtic horsemen sweeping down from the hills to probe the Roman outer defenses. Caesar released his own cavalry through gaps in the outer wall to meet them in the plain. The cavalry battle raged across the valley floor for most of the day, neither side winning decisively. But as darkness fell, the Gauls withdrew. The outer wall had held. The legions on the inner wall watched Alesia's garrison, which had surged to the walls at the sound of battle, fall silent again. That night, inside Alesia, the mood shifted. Supplies had been measured again. The relief army had come, but the Roman walls had not broken. Rationing was tightened. and a terrible question began forming in the minds of Gallic warriors. What if the walls never broke? On the second night, the relief army launched a massive coordinated assault after midnight. Tens of thousands of warriors rushing the outer wall under cover of darkness, carrying bundled sticks to fill the ditches, hooks to tear down palisades, and scaling ladders for the rampart. The Roman wall shuddered under the weight of the assault. Defenders threw javelins, fired artillery, and thrust spears at attackers clawing their way up the rampart. The traps before the wall, the Sippi, the Lilia, took a savage toll, but still, the Gauls came. At the same moment, Vercingetorix threw open Alesia's gates and launched a massive sortie against the inner wall, trying to coordinate with the relief army to crush the Romans from both sides at once. For a terrifying moment, the Roman lines were under attack everywhere simultaneously. The noise was overwhelming. War horns, artillery, screaming, the crash of weapons on shields, from every direction at once. Caesar rode the interior lines himself, assessing each section, sending reinforcements where the fighting was hottest. But the walls held. As dawn approached, both Gallic forces withdrew, battered and repulsed. The relief army's commanders were shaken. Their massive night assault had failed against walls they had not expected to be so strong. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's sortie had also been beaten back. Time was still running, but the plan had to change. Inside Alesia, the mathematics of starvation were relentless. Every day that passed without a breach in the Roman walls consumed more of the food supply. Vercingetorix's warriors were now on half rations. The horses, too expensive to feed, were being slaughtered for meat. In a moment of devastating desperation, one of Alesia's elders made a proposal that has haunted history ever since. To save the warriors' strength, the old men, the women, and the children should be expelled from the town, pushed out through the gates toward the Roman lines, so the fighting men could last longer. Vercingetorix agreed. Thousands of non-combatants were pushed out of Alesia's gates, into the valley below, into the no man's land between the two walls. They begged the Romans to take them as slaves. Anything, rather than starvation in the open air. Caesar refused them entry. Allowing thousands of extra mouths into the Roman supply system would have strained his own logistics. The civilians of Alesia died in the open, between the walls, neither saved by Rome nor taken back by their own people. It remains one of the darkest moments of the siege. Caesar's supply situation was also under strain. Feeding 50,000 soldiers in a ring 40 kilometers long required constant logistics. Foraging parties sent into the surrounding countryside ran constant risks. But the Romans held together. Discipline, organization, and the legionary ethos carried them through. The Gallic relief commanders had spent days studying the Roman walls, probing for weakness. Their scouts discovered something crucial. On the northwestern side of the Roman outer defenses, where the wall crossed a section of rising ground, the fortifications were incomplete and the terrain made defense harder. The relief commanders devised their final plan, a massive three-pronged coordinated assault. 60,000 warriors under Vercingetorix would strike the weak northern camp before dawn. Simultaneously, relief cavalry and infantry would storm the outer wall from the front, and Vercingetorix would launch his heaviest sortie yet against the inner wall. The northern camp's defenders had no warning until it was too late. In the gray light before full dawn, 60,000 Gallic warriors surged out of the darkness, screaming, weapons raised, in a wave that struck the Roman northern positions like a physical blow. The northern defenses buckled. Warriors poured through gaps, overwhelmed sentries on the wall walk, and fought their way into the Roman camp interior. For a terrifying stretch of time, it seemed the outer line would break entirely, and with it, Caesar's entire strategy. The Roman officers at the northern camp held their nerve. They fell back to prepared secondary positions, rallied their men, and held, barely, but they were outnumbered and pressed from multiple directions. Messengers raced to Caesar with one message: the north is breaking. Caesar himself rode. He gathered cavalry reserves from the interior corridor and rode hard for the north, visible to his own men on the walls as he passed. The sight of their general personally riding to the crisis point, steadying nerves along the entire line. When Caesar arrived, he was visible to both sides, his distinctive crimson cloak marking him clearly. He threw cavalry around the flanks of the Gallic assault force and hit them from the sides, even as the battered northern infantry pressed them from the front. The flanking cavalry hit the Gauls like a hammer. Warriors who had been pressing the wall suddenly found Roman horsemen cutting into their rear and sides. Cohesion, already strained after a night march and hard fighting, began to dissolve. The Gallic assault on the north wavered. On all three fronts, the Roman lines held. The coordinated Gallic plan, which had come within moments of succeeding, began to collapse from the edges inward. The northern assault broke first, then the frontal attack faltered. Then Vercingetorix's sortie was beaten back into Alesia's gates. Once the northern Gallic force broke, the retreat became a rout. Warriors who had believed they were on the verge of victory suddenly found themselves running, pursued by Roman cavalry whose horses moved far faster than fleeing men on foot. The relief cavalry, which had been unable to break the outer wall despite desperate charges, saw the northern column break and lost heart. Tribal contingents began peeling away, each group deciding independently that the battle was lost. The great army of 250,000 began to dissolve. Caesar's cavalry poured through gaps in the outer wall and pursued the fleeing Gauls across the open country beyond, cutting down warriors for miles. Many tribal leaders escaped, many warriors did not. The relief army, the greatest force Gaul had ever assembled, ceased to exist as a fighting force within hours. By evening, the plain beyond the Roman walls was empty of living enemies. The last screams had faded. The last horn calls from the relief army had gone silent. From Alesia's heights, Vercingetorix could see what had happened. His relief army, his entire hope, was gone. Vercingetorix stood on the heights and looked at the empty hills. For a moment, whatever the historical sources do not record, he must have understood completely what had happened. The relief army had come. The walls had not broken. The plan had failed. Gaul's last hope was extinguished. The next morning, Alesia was silent. There was nothing left to fight for, and nothing left to eat. Vercingetorix called his council of chieftains one final time. Some argued for a last desperate sortie, death in battle rather than surrender. Vercingetorix overruled them. He would surrender, and he would do it alone. Vercingetorix prepared himself with ceremony. He dressed in his finest armor and mounted his best horse. Whatever was about to happen, he would meet it as a king, not as a broken man. This was the final act of a warrior who had fought the greatest empire in the world and nearly won. He rode out of the gates of Alesia alone. Down the slope, across the valley floor, toward the Roman lines, Caesar had taken his seat on a tribunal, a raised platform before the walls, surrounded by his legates and officers, waiting. What Vercingetorix did next has entered history as one of its most powerful images. According to ancient accounts, he rode his horse in a great circle around Caesar's tribunal, a final act of honor, before dismounting. Then, he removed his armor, piece by piece, and laid it at Caesar's feet. He knelt before Julius Caesar, the man who had united Gaul, who had burned his own people's cities to deny Rome their use, who had inflicted the only battlefield defeat of Caesar's campaign. He knelt. Caesar accepted the surrender without a word that history has preserved. The rebellion of Gaul was over. The garrison of Alesia surrendered and marched out. They were distributed among Caesar's legions as slaves, a common fate for defeated enemies in the ancient world. The oppidum was stripped of valuables. The rebellion that had nearly broken Rome's grip on Gaul was finished in a single autumn morning. The fall of Alesia effectively ended the Great Gallic Rebellion. Some scattered resistance continued through the winter of 51 BC, but without Vercingetorix, without a unified command, and with the tribes exhausted from years of war, it was a matter of mopping up rather than genuine threat. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was complete. In 8 years of war, an estimated 1 million Gauls had been killed and another million enslaved. Figures that ancient sources give and that modern historians debate but find plausible in scale. The face of Western Europe was permanently changed. For Caesar, the conquest of Gaul was the foundation of everything that followed. The wealth it generated financed his political ambitions. The veteran legions that had fought at Alesia would later march with him across the Rubicon, the act that plunged Rome into civil war and transformed the Republic into what would become the Empire. Vercingetorix was taken to Rome in chains. There he would wait for 6 years. This was not unusual in Roman practice. A captive of such prestige was preserved for his captor's greatest moment of public display. In 46 BC, Caesar finally celebrated his triumph over Gaul, a spectacular multi-day parade through Rome, displaying the spoils and prisoners of his conquests. Vercingetorix walked through the streets of Rome in chains, paraded before hundreds of thousands of people who screamed and jeered at the barbarian king who had dared to challenge their empire. At the end of the triumph, Vercingetorix was taken to the Tullianum, Rome's most ancient prison, half underground, and executed. The manner was ritual strangulation, the Roman state's standard end for captive enemy kings paraded in triumph. He had been held alive for 6 years to serve this single political purpose. 2,000 years later, a great bronze statue of Vercingetorix stands on the hilltop of Mont Ossois, where Alesia once stood. Ordered by Napoleon III, who was fascinated by the siege, the statue shows the Gallic king staring defiantly toward the horizon. His face, deliberately, bears a resemblance to Napoleon. Military historians have studied the Siege of Alesia for 2,000 years. What Caesar accomplished, a complete double encirclement that simultaneously blockaded a fortified garrison and repulsed a relief army of potentially 250,000, remains one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering and command in recorded history. Consider the mathematics. Caesar had approximately 50,000 soldiers. Inside Alesia were 80,000. Outside, hundreds of thousands more. In theory, the Romans were outnumbered 6 or 7 to 1. That they not only survived but triumphed speaks to the genius of the defensive position Caesar created. The victory was built on several pillars. First, engineering. The traps, ditches, walls, and towers multiplied the effectiveness of every Roman soldier dramatically. Men fighting from prepared positions with obstacles before them could hold against odds that would have been impossible in open battle. Second, mobility of reserves. The corridor between the two walls was Caesar's secret weapon. It allowed cavalry and infantry to race from any quiet section to any threatened section within minutes. This interior position gave a smaller force the ability to respond to attacks on a perimeter far larger than their numbers should have allowed. Third, Caesar himself. In the critical moment of the northern assault, the moment when the Roman lines came closest to breaking, his personal appearance on horseback steadied his troops and directed the counterattack that saved the siege. Great commanders throughout history have known that there are moments when personal presence cannot be delegated. The Gallic plan was not without merit. The coordinated three-pronged assault that nearly broke the northern camp was tactically sophisticated. Vercingetorix and his relief commanders understood that they needed simultaneous pressure on multiple points to overwhelm Roman flexibility. They came very close, but very close was not enough. After Alesia, Caesar ordered his fortifications carefully documented. His own account of the siege, preserved in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, remains the primary source for everything we know. Caesar was not a modest writer, but even his enemies among Roman historians admitted that what he had achieved at Alesia was extraordinary. The Roman conquest of Gaul that Alesia sealed did not merely change political control. It transformed the entire civilization of what would become France. Over the following centuries, Gaul became one of the most thoroughly Romanized provinces in the empire, its people adopting Latin, Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman religion. The Latin spoken in Roman Gaul evolved over centuries into Old French, and Old French became Modern French. The language you hear in Paris today descends in direct lineage from the Roman soldiers and administrators who arrived in the wake of Caesar's conquest. Alesia is, in a strange sense, one of the ancestors of France. And when Rome embraced Christianity, it was through the Roman provincial infrastructure of Gaul that the new faith spread into northwestern Europe, planting the churches, dioceses, and monasteries that would survive the fall of Rome and carry civilization forward into the medieval world. The chain of consequence from Alesia is immeasurably long. Without the Romanization of Gaul, the Christianity that emerged from Roman Gaul takes a different shape. The medieval civilization that grew from those roots changes. The French language, French law, French philosophy, all bent differently by a different past. History's hinges are often found in the most unexpected places. And what of Vercingetorix himself? He lost. History, as they say, is written by the victors, and Caesar's account leaves him as a worthy but defeated enemy, a prop in Rome's greatest general's greatest story. But 2,000 years of re-evaluation have given him something different. In France, Vercingetorix became a founding myth, the first French hero, the man who united the tribes in defense of their homeland against a foreign invader. Napoleon III made him a symbol. French schoolchildren learned his name before Caesar's. His bronze face still stares from a French coin. Today, in the quiet Burgundy countryside of eastern France, the hill of Montausois rises above vineyards and farmland. The Roman walls are gone. The ditches have filled with 2,000 years of soil. Alesia is grass and sky and silence. But underneath, archaeologists continue to find it. Tent stakes, arrowheads, coins, the iron barbs of the Lilia, the physical remnants of the 6 weeks that changed the world. Each artifact pulled from the Alesian soil is a voice from the past. A legionary dropped that arrowhead as he ran along the wall walk to repel a night assault. A Gallic warrior wore that torque when he charged the Roman lines. They were men, frightened, resolute, exhausted, brave, caught in the hinge of history. The Siege of Alesia lasted approximately 6 weeks in the autumn of 52 BC. In those 6 weeks, Julius Caesar built a wonder of military engineering, held his outnumbered army together against odds that should have broken it, and brought to an end the greatest resistance the Celtic world would ever mount against Roman power. He did not do it alone. 50,000 soldiers built those walls with their hands, bled to hold them, and died to keep the line intact. But Caesar's name is the one history kept. It usually is. Vercingetorix chose to surrender rather than let his remaining warriors die in a hopeless last stand. It was, in its way, a final act of leadership, trading his own freedom and life for the survival of his men. Caesar recognized it. History recognized it. And the land where it happened, this quiet French hillside, remembers it still, in the silence that lies over every old battlefield. The Battle of Alesia, 1 siege, 2 walls, 50,000 Romans against the world. Thank you for watching Hidden Worlds. If this journey through one of history's greatest battles moved you, share it with someone who loves history. And we will see you in the next Hidden World.